So thank you, Pnina. So the panel that will be currently presenting, as Pnina said, will be focusing on United States and the Middle East. So I would like to present our panel participants. First of all, Sima Shay. Sima, she is the director of the research program Iran, the Shia Axis. Shia retired from the Ministry of Strategic Matters and served as the deputy of CEO in charge of the Iranian portfolio from 2009 till 2015. Prior to that, she was a deputy of the head of the Council of National Security on Strategic Matters from 2008 until 2009. Majority of her professional career she dedicated to Mossad and the reconnaissance community. Her last role was the head of the research division in Mossad.
Dr. Yoel Guzansky.
Dr. Yoel Guzansky. He is the head of the Gulf Studies here in the United States, and he was also a fellow researcher in the Middle Eastern Institute in Washington. He also served in the Council of National Security and was an advisor to the Ministries of Strategic Matters and the Ministry of Reconnaissance. He's focusing on the Gulf Arabic politics and strategy. It includes strategic matters and stability of the regimes and proliferation of the nuclear. He was also a guest lecturer in Stanford University, and he received a Fulbright Award on behalf of the American government. And Brigadier General Yossi Kuperwasser, who is the director of the National Security Program and the Matters of the Middle East in Jerusalem Center on the Matters of Foreign Affairs, JCFA. He served as the Director General of the Ministry of Strategic Matters and the head of research in the Intelligence Service of Israel. And the last but not the least, Dr. Shay Har-Zvi. He's the head of the regional field and the Reichman University Institute of Strategy. So we have here a certain theme. As I mentioned, our panel today will be dedicated to the American foreign policy in the Middle East, and we'll try to analyze American perception of this region following 7th of October. We are here in Israel in the midst of this multi-arena war, the first of its sorts. How a regional war or non-regional general war is perceived by the Americans, and as we mentioned in the previous panel, as a critical aspect of Israel to cope with the current reality is the unprecedented support it receives from the United States. That includes the aid in reconnaissance, aerial support, munition, and military presence in the region. Nevertheless, the United States has worked in defined the Indo-Pacific arena as extremely important one in its foreign affairs. The Obama administration called it a pivot to Asia, transferring American resources in order to compete with China and the competition with the superpowers. Jake Sullivan wrote a letter in Foreign Affairs before he took his role as the National Security Advisor about the reducing American presence in the Middle East while using diplomacy, aggressive diplomacy, as a tool in order to reduce the local tension, the regional tension, and American involvement in the region. So I would like to turn to the panel at that point, a crucial question that I have to present to you. How the Americans perceive the Middle East after 7th of October, after October 7th, and I would like to start with you, Yoel. Very significant part of the American strategy was based on the aspiration to build the regional architecture and normalization with the Saudis. So following October 7th, we had discussions, and the ambassador also mentioned the American aspiration to implement that. Where we are at now. Thank you for inviting me, and I'll take a step back, or actually and 2 steps forward afterwards, and we'll talk about the Arabic space, and later on we'll connect it to normalization in Israel in the beginning of Biden administration. That was actually the lowest unprecedented point in relationship between the American administration and Arabic countries, outstanding Arabic countries, and in particular the most important Arabic country to United States in the region, and that would be Saudi Arabia. after the period when the relationships were relatively good under Trump's administration. Biden declared declarations, stated statements, prior state, if you remember, after the Saudis refused to re-increase their oil production after Biden's visit to Riyadh in 22. Biden said there will be consequences, and there were consequences, in fact, but they're completely different from what he said. He also implemented different steps that infringed Saudi's interests. He stopped an export of offensive munition to some of the Gulf countries, and we did saw a certain tendency during the last 3 years. As a researcher, I was fascinated by this tendency, really. Countries that were perceived as pro-American, that were deeply perceived within the American Western camp, implemented independent foreign policy the way they never did in the past, and they actually acted against American interests in Ukraine and in other places with China in a very blatant manner, in fact, since the oil embargo in the 70s. To that extent, really, it sounds dramatic, but it is actually. But the importance of them as assets for the Americans, in their own eyes, in their own perception, not just in their own perception, especially the oil production states, the large and significant in the Gulf, increased because of the Ukraine war and the crisis of energy, and the Saudi Arabia that became, from being prior state to the belle of the ball. In fact, look at the number of visits of the Americans during the last 2 years in the Saudi Arabia. My dearest friend, Dr. Anwar Gargash from the Emirates, today he's advisor of the president. I quote him. He is mind-blowing, really, been public quote, really. It's extraordinary example of perception of the Gulf and Arabic countries versus West and the Americans as the patron. Gargash praised this sitting on the fence of those countries in the Ukrainian context and in other contexts as well, China, for example. And he said, choosing a side at that point will lead to more violence. And he added, the Americans need to bear in mind the world is not unipolar any longer. And this is the Gargash, he's very senior advisor. He was a Minister of Foreign Affairs of AUE. The hedging is classic, really, here. It's not a new behavior in the Arabic countries. It expresses a different understanding of global order that is currently is multipolar world. And now they're playing between different parties, and a certain doubt concerning the American willingness to step to their defense. The lack of trust in America is bipartisan. He didn't believe Trump. They didn't step up for them in 2019 where the Saudis' facilities were attacked, and they don't believe Biden. They responded in January of 2022 when Dubai and the Emirates were attacked by the Houthis. This Saudis' policy succeeded. And as a response, Americans were the ones that changed their policy. They aligned, in fact, after the Saudis. So basically, the tail wiggled the dog, and as a part of the American intent to bring closer their allies in the Gulf. And in the light of the preference to stop and block China and to create some kind of Iranian blocking camp, started the negotiations for a signature of a list of different defense agreements between Arabic countries, the Emirates, and the US, the Saudis, which is better known, obviously, and a successful signature of the campaign with Bahrain, with the small Bahrain, a year ago. In the Israeli context, and I'll be finishing very soon, the United States would like to create a connection between the provision of munition and Saudi agreement and normalization with Israel, and the agreement to nuclear developments. Before the war on 6th of October, there was already a draft on the table of such a normalization agreement. I know that from the British ambassador, the Saudi ambassador in the UK, who's a very reliable source of that kind of information. And he stated that openly. And one should state the truth. Two last sentences. Hamas managed to stop, even temporarily, first of all, the process itself, the momentum, obviously. But the initiative is still on the table of different reasons, different stipulations of each of the players. In the Saudi view, they leave it on the table because they're American carrots. They don't want to be the who refuse. They leave it in our hands. We're really good at it. They don't want to say no to the Americans. They say yes, and then in parentheses they add all the stipulations and buts. But what changed after the beginning of the war, the momentum was stopped by the way of the contacts and the connections. And the price of normalization is much higher at that point, not just for Israel, but for all the players. The Saudis need, well, they need the American support. Americans should be more involved in Gaza and Palestinian arena. Americans should be more proactive in the region and more leading. Without that, Saudis will not join. And Israel obviously has to do much more. And look at the reports from the last month on the Palestinian issue and the topic of the Palestinian state. And I will stop here. Sima. So we look at this region, and Israel is surrounded all over by Iran and its proxies. So how American strategy changed towards Iran and its proxies following 7th of October? Well, indeed, one of the developments, we have so many things that changed following October 7th, obviously, but we probably will touch some of the aspects. And first of all, we must state that in addition to the war that is taking place now between Hamas and Israel and Hezbollah, there are two big players of different scope, obviously, that are outside the initial circle, and this is the United States and Iran. The very fact that I'm putting them in the same row is already a significant change, in fact, because we must remember and bear in mind that Iran is the funder and financier and the mediator of all the proxies, and active in the region. United States, as it seems, allegedly speaking, is facing the East. At least two administrations already. The Middle East is less of an interest for us, and we're going to the Far East. From the other hand, what do we see after October 7th? Two of those countries deeply active, not just active as diplomats, but active under the table in the Middle East. So we must re-examine anew all the concepts we believed in following October 7th. We also must re-examine the concepts of the United States and Iran within their relationships and towards the Middle East. I will only add one word about the United States before I'll move to both of them and the interaction. In the end of the day, as we always said, the Middle East, whether you want to leave it, will be forcing itself back. And there's no doubt that Trump, obviously, and Obama, and I assume to some extent of Biden in the beginning, they wanted to go to different direction to invest the resources, the financial and diplomatic and energetic resources into Asia and not into the Middle East. Nevertheless, they didn't do that. They couldn't do that because, as we said, Middle East is forcing himself. But when we look at the last year, at any aspect, United States is deeply invested into Middle East the way they never did within 2 decades. When we look at the first parameter, for example, investment of time of the seniors of the administration, they mentioned all the visits into the region, manifestation of military power directly, unprecedented really, provision of munition at courses. Maybe Ukraine gets more, but I doubt. Actually, I never looked into it. From the other hand, I still doubt it. And all the commitment and the willingness to appear. So when we look at that, Americans are invested in the Middle East much more than they were during the previous decades. Obviously, there's no need to mention the dependency of Israel upon the United States has been mentioned before. I will present it from a different angle. The general mentioned here the matter of our visibility on 13th and 14th of April without the aerial defense system that CENTCOM organized in the area together with international forces and regional forces. So I don't want to expand on that, but obviously that was a first-hand and important testimony we received. But we must understand this is an American commitment, American investment in the Middle East, an American commitment here. It's something that the Saudis as well, when they look at it, and the Emirates and all of those that had a tremendous disappointment with the Americans. Now they tell themselves, well, maybe it's a new story here. I think we need to bear in mind that in addition to what Israel is seeing here, we might have a new story in the eyes of other factors. 2 last words because I finished this round, and I would like to talk about America and Iran. Though 2 of those countries, they do not communicate directly, formally speaking, obviously. And when there were actually discussions, it was always the mediation of the Europeans. The pipelines of communication with Iran are open and they work big time. So on this matter, 2 things really. Iran is the only factor that is being deterred, and let's not get confused. There are no declarations of Gallant to Bibi, it's United States. And when the president sends them war-shaped care and says don't, that was care of the Iranians. And when we are in a current situation when Iran, regardless of the fact that the leader, on the very first day after the assassination of Haniyeh, said that Iran will be responding, and again, today we see that they didn't, not because they're afraid of Israel. They're not afraid of Israel, only because the American presence, and let's not forget that even for a split second. And the communication pipelines, we need to talk about that maybe. There's a new president in Iran, no new leader though, but he is the last decisive factor. But the different ambience, really, such a different ambience. And from what we see actually powerfully is actually the need to remove the sanctions and the discussion of the need to remove the sanctions. And removing the sanctions is actually synonym of the new nuclear agreement. You can't remove sanctions without signing a new nuclear agreement. And if you think everything that happened between the United States and Iran and during the war is just an unnecessary random example,
Yossi.
we need to look into the future. Yossi.
Sima mentioned the unprecedented military support that the United States had given to Israel and how it stood beside Israel in the Middle East. I'd like to ask you if you've identified some kind of a change in terms of how the United States are viewing the United States in their list of priorities on a global level. Look, the United States, for the Americans, is part of the global picture. It is one of the theaters. The United States, first and foremost, sees itself as involved in the great power competition. That's the main part of its foreign policy. They had to focus on the Ukrainians in this context with that fear of what would happen with Taiwan as well and Chinese aspirations. And the Middle East was supposed to have a lower priority, even though it was always pushed in that direction. The rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran at the sponsored by the Chinese, the Russians relying more on Iranian materiel. The Middle East was always there in the background, but what happened on the 7th of October made this even clearer. The Americans, this administration, came into their started their jobs with all kinds of aspirations about the Middle East. And over time, they did this reality check as even before the 7th of October, and Trump particularly, and right now his policy is very different from the one he started with. Everybody here is talking about normalization with Saudi Arabia. That wasn't the direction, as Yoel said. The idea was to punish Saudi Arabia for various reasons, and they all of a sudden the Middle East forced them to go in that direction because of the great power competition to prevent the Chinese from expanding their influence. They understood that they needed to align with the Saudis. With the Palestinians, we're also somewhere else. And the Iranian issue, the main idea, let me remind you of Obama's idea of dividing hegemony in the Middle East between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It turned out to the Americans, and this idea constantly researched, there was an attempt to go in that direction. And the turning point was the decision to fire road modeling because they understood that they're on a collision course with Iran and not in a process of rapprochement and not an agreement for Iranian hegemony in the northern part of the Middle East. Now our reality, as Sima said, is one where the United States is still, first of all, is committed in light of to prevent the expansion of this war into a regional war. That's the most important thing. But in this setting, the Americans see the Iranians as a threat, as something that could end up in conflict. They don't want to get there, but they're preparing for the possibility that will happen when they bring the USS Georgia with certain offensive capabilities. That means that they're not just committed to defending Israel. We also see ourselves as those who must be prepared for the possibility that the war will expand. We don't want that, but we need to be prepared for that eventuality. And I have to say that here, what's interesting is the difference between the Israeli perception and the American perception. While the Americans, their emphasis is preventing the expansion of this war at almost every cost with a don't and threats against Iran and all kinds of other things that they did in order to convince the people, the system, not to expand this war. And it's worked reasonably well for them. Israel, however, I'm not sure that it is committed to the same extent. It doesn't want to take the same steps that the United States would like to take in order to ensure that this war won't expand. Israel does want a victory in this war. Israel is saying, if there's such a big multi-theater war going on, let's win the war. Let's stop in a state of stalemate, which is basically an achievement for Hamas, Hezbollah and Hamas. We want to defeat our enemy. And the Americans understand that aspiration to defeat the enemy may lead to a more expanded conflict, whereby interests and what's important to each side will be in jeopardy. Therefore, everything that was said here before regarding the tensions between the Americans and Israelis stem from something that's much deeper than values and interests. It's a totally different understanding about the reality that we're in right now. We think that this is an existential issue that we want to win with. But I think the Prime Minister would like to basically use this to defeat his enemies. The Americans think that particularly at this time, but beyond this time, defeating the enemy will mean that they'll have to take risks that they really wouldn't want to take. And this is the main tension between the sides here. Just a few last remarks. This has also implications for the Palestinian issue. They would like to go in a certain direction, and it's difficult for them to concede on this dream, and that is tied to the fact that certain parts of the American population, particularly those groups of American Jews, and particularly part of the Muslim population in the United States, that have a major weight in the elections. The Palestinian issue, when they look at all of the Middle East, the Palestinian issue specifically is very important for them. And therefore, the gaps between us and the Americans in this issue it's no trifling issue. It's a major thing because it affects the ties between the parties, between the two countries' governments. The Palestinian issue that was supposed to be marginal has already become so central. Thank you, Yossi. Shay. So I would like to take us and basically zoom out a bit. Iran isn't acting alone in the Middle East. And since the Russian incursion into Ukraine, we've seen an expansion of the ties between Ukraine and Iran, as well as the creation of an anti-hegemonic step that includes Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea as well. I'd like to ask you, since the 7th of October and Operation Swords of Iron, how does this war, and according to American strategic perspective, how do they see what's happening in the Middle East as a superpower in terms of the competition between superpowers? In the view of the Americans, the war in the Middle East is basically reflects is a reflection of a much wider conflict. The world is in a conflict between the liberal camp led by the United States, and in this case, the axis led by China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And since the beginning of the war, President Biden several times said that just like the Ukrainians need to face the Russians, Israel also needs to defeat Hamas because that's an American interest. But there's an understanding that this is much broader. As they said here before, it's clear that the Americans for over a decade would like to divert all of its resources to Asia. And in its national security strategy from October 22, it said that China is the main factor that could undermine American hegemony. But reality is different for both Obama and for Trump and for Biden as well. We talked about that during the preparation. Al Pacino in The Godfather, who said, they pulled me back just when I thought I had already gone out. If I remember in that movie, he got a heart attack, but Later on, he got a heart attack. But this was the American reality. In other words, they understand that the Middle East, they are deeply involved here, and people spoke very deeply and profoundly about American intervention, about the military, economic Iron Dome and judicial Iron Dome that the Americans have given us since October 7th. And we have to add their perception of alliances to this. One way that Biden is different from Trump is its perception of alliances. We're seeing this with NATO, with the reviving of NATO, as opposed to what Macron which said when he said that NATO is suffering from brain damage. We're seeing AUKUS in Asia and other places in the Middle East. And normalization, the context of normalization is not just what's called an alliance between Israel and Saudi Arabia. The ambassador correctly stated that it's about integrating Israel into the Middle East, is taking this entire region against the Iranian axis. And when we say the Iranian axis, that's against Russia and normalization. They didn't start driving this process after these things, but it was after March 2023, of course, with the reconciliation agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran through Chinese mediation. So there is a much broader dimension where the outcomes of the world war will affect Israel's security, but they also understand that it will affect the region and the entire global system. You talked about the tight connection between Russia and China, the success of the radical axis. In that context, we need to understand the very broad perception of the Americans. Thank you, Shay. Okay, so I'd like to go on to Shira this time. And this is more about looking towards the future. I would like to ask each of you how the Americans see the Middle East after the October 7th, when every American citizen goes to the ballot box. How will they look at the Middle East in the future? Of course, there are major gaps between Harris and Donald Trump in their foreign policies, but I'd like to hear this from you. I'll start from you, Yoel. How will they, in the future, how will they perceive our region? I'm happy that the question was about the Americans, but I'll answer about the Saudis. What do the Saudis want? Ultimately, this aligns with what the Americans want. And you'll see that they're quite similar. First of all, this isn't a good time for normalization. If you were to ask MBS right now, this isn't the right time. Israel is now toxic in the region. Nobody wants to be involved in with the Palestinians in Gaza. Who needs that? That's not the Saudi interest. If the Americans impose that on them as part of a bargain, then yes. But if they could choose, if it's their choice, they really wouldn't want that. They wouldn't want to be involved with boots on the ground in Gaza. That's an illusion. They haven't succeeded for 7 years in Yemen. They don't have an appetite for that or any experience. Since the beginning of the war, the Saudis have climbed up a very high tree within the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Their demands, there's almost no vagueness in Saudi demands from Israel with regard to the Palestinians. It's very clear as a Palestinian state, and we're seeing every week reports and leaks about this issue. By the way, these are steps that are almost irreversible. It will be very difficult for them to come down and say afterwards, no, we didn't really say Palestinian state. Perhaps they might do that if the price is right. They've done that in the past. By the way, the end of the war and a ceasefire will allow them to go back to being more pragmatic. Maybe that vagueness will come back. The farther we'll go from the war, the easier it will be for them to draw closer to their previous positions. But we'll wait and see. Looking more broadly, the war between Israel and Hamas brought a lot of risks to the Arab countries. If they could choose, they would be happy to keep as far away as possible from the war, to strengthen their détente between them and the Iranians, which we think that was very successful because it's potentially, at least on paper, it kept a lot of dangers at bay and kept them out of the line of fire. They were in a major tension. The pragmatic countries and the Gulf states are interested in weakening and dismantling Hamas as much as possible. That means extending the war. And extending the war means more criticism, more destabilization in their countries. They don't want that. That's why we saw from a very early stage a call and even action taken to lead to a ceasefire, because in this tension, they prefer to stay stable, even if Hamas remains in power. That's not what they want, but that's what's happening. Look, up until now, the Abraham Accords are a success story. We have to say this honestly. Who would have believed that after 40,000, more than 40,000, I don't know how many people were killed really, what the accurate numbers, but with that amount of destruction in Gaza and thousands of dead Palestinians, all of the the peace agreement with Israel, the new ones and the old ones are still intact. But they have definitely cooled their ties, and they've maintained a very low profile. The public opinion in their world isn't at a nadir. The U.S. The same for how they view the Americans. They really don't like what's happening there. And I'll say a few more sentences. Somebody here mentioned earlier, and we wrote this, that the Arabs could see American aid to Israel as some kind of hope, that if they are ever attacked, they hope at least that this is a model for American action in the future in the Middle East. If there is ever an Iranian attack on any of those Gulf countries, that would be great. I don't think that they're convinced that that's the case for two reasons, or maybe more, at least two. First of all, they're very fearful, and they're concerned of the American difficulty with deterring Iran and its proxy from taking certain actions. They've been in the Red Sea since November, but they haven't managed to deter the Houthis or to stop the Houthi operations at a very high cost. They also see the American aid to Israel since the 7th of October as something unusual. The rulers of the Gulf countries aren't naive. They know that the attitude towards Israel is a bit different. And they aren't sure that this is how the United States will behave in the future. Two last points, and I know that we're out of time. Two important variables in terms of the possible future dangers. One, what happens if Trump is elected? What does that do to the ties between the United States and the Gulf countries and with the other Arab countries? I don't think that they have a preference. They'll be very disappointed in Trump in 2019. They were very disappointed who left them on their own and forced them to change their policy vis-a-vis Iran. Saudi Arabia has changed its policy, choosing a detente and reconciliation, mainly because of this attack. If the American response were to be different, we may have seen things play out differently. So the attitude towards Trump is very ambivalent. And the second very important point in this discussion, and that people don't really address, is the possibility of a bilateral agreement between the Americans and Saudi Arabia without an Israeli component. As time goes by, and if Israel avoids going towards a ceasefire, bringing back hostages and Hamas, and that keeps the option of ending the war and a ceasefire away, and because everything is built like an inverted pyramid based on the release of the hostages, there is a possibility that's not the fact of a bilateral agreement between the Americans and Saudi Arabians that has a nuclear component with civilian nuclear technology, including enrichment on Saudi soil, which poses a major risk. The chances that this risk will materialize and without getting normalization is going up. We've gotten all of the bad parts of that agreement, but we haven't ended up with normalization.
So I'll be very brief. I have 2 points I wanted to bring up. When we look into the future, the American administration will have, again, we're looking from the Israeli point of view, obviously. In this case, it will be also quite connected, but the main issue that will be standing on the agenda of any American president that will be elected within 2 months from now is the Iranian nuclear program that is currently at a very advanced stage, unprecedentedly advanced stages. From one hand, Iran can decide whether they will decide politically that they're going for a bomb. It's not a matter of technological feasibility, just a political decision and willingness to pay the price. From the other hand, we do hear, as I said previously, from the new president, we have the statements of need to remove the sanctions and the permit that the leader gave to negotiate with Americans. So in fact, this issue will be standing on the high on the agenda of an American president and obviously on the agenda of the State of Israel. I don't know who will be the next prime minister in the next year, but this current Israel will continue to do what it does now for the last 15 years. It will continue, and our prime minister will go and speak in Congress against the dialogue of Americans and Iranians, which I think really even the Trump administration or Harris administration will be engaging with the dialogue with Iran. They will be again banging their head in the wall. Trump, again, if you did forget, as someone who is working on Iran for 2 or 3 decades at least, I follow everything that American leaders say about that. Trump begged, he didn't ask, he begged for an agreement with the Iranians. He said, I'll give you will have rehabilitation of your economy, will be given that. Just come under the agreement. Obviously, it depends which agreement and etc. I'm not getting into details. But this is the main issue for any American administration that is about to come to the White House, and Israel must understand it. As I said, they will want negotiation, and Israel needs to think, what are we going to do in this negotiation? Will we be opposing, or will we partake, taking a deep breath, rethinking and seeing what happened after they went against the agreement and where Iran is today, and think, how can we require maximum requirements and demands of the United States? Obviously, I will say, since it's time to say something openly, I will say something that I think is extremely important that wasn't in the previous agreement and negotiations. Israel has to ask Americans that if they negotiate with Iran, the nuclear plan cannot be promoted during negotiations. It continued to promote the program without any restriction. This time we must require Americans to prohibit from Iranians to move on with the nuclear plan during the negotiations. A document should provide it. We're working on it in the Institute. Building new ingredients of the next agreements and the presence of the Americans in the Middle East as well. I would like to remind all of us, President Trump will think that because he actually built the embassy in Jerusalem, he was the most pro-American president. He wanted to remove his forces from Syria without an Israeli pressure and Bolton's pressure, then we wouldn't have Americans in Syria today. If he will come back to the White House, I'm doubtful that he will change his mind. Maybe actually the other way around, and if he leaves Syria, he will leave Iraq. As Israel is concerned, extremely important to retain American presence in Iraq and Syria. Thank you.
Yossi, bevakasha.
So Yossi, your turn. I'll put it this way. First of all, I agree with my predecessors here, all the previous speakers, and Sima, mostly with Sima, always with Sima. But I do think that there's a very significant influence upon American foreign policy in the Middle East will be the end of this war, and how will it end? If Israel will overpower Hamas, that's a completely different Middle East as Americans are concerned, and a lot of different factors will go with a stronger horse. And the potentials that will unfold will be very different and will not win this war. Therefore, it doesn't matter who will be elected. Obviously, both of the administrations will be looking at the question of who won this war, what happened. If Israel will not win it, it will require compromises with Iran, different understandings of what is happening in the Saudi context. So that will present Americans at the position of weakness. If we'll be reaching a decisive result in this campaign, and if we'll manage to overpower in the north, that will be a completely different story in comparison to continuation of this campaign. I think the Americans will be looking closely upon this matter and will be making their decisions based on this development. And as Sima just said, I want to repeat everything she analyzed, what the Iranians will do in the nuclear context. Iranian race for nuclear and the Iranian success to obtain nuclear weapons. This is an American failure. We look at it from our particular point of view as Israelis, but that's true, obviously, but it's not just Israeli failure, it's an American huge failure. Americans pledged that the Iranians will not have nuclear weapons, and if they will, it's actually also required re-examination of any American administration that will come to power. I don't think that, obviously, they always prefer the diplomatic ways, but if diplomatic ways will not deliver, possibly they might not have a choice, though obviously, well, do they want to see the Middle East? They would love to see the Middle East that is not threatening, that doesn't require their involvement in military action. They would like to see advancement on Palestinian issue, obviously, many things they would like to see here, but I think they understand better that the dreams of the Middle East might be quite distant, and the chances of realizing those dreams might be not that high. So what are they going to do in this reality of lack of progress towards their dreams? They always come to us with different requirements and blames. Well, your strategy, what is our strategy? What are you doing here? What is the American strategy then? They don't have a clear strategy of what to do with the Middle East that is not going to the right direction or desired direction. Shay, so different angles, and I think from a strategic point of view, when you look at it, there is some kind of similarity. The tactics will be completely different, but there is a certain similarity between Harris and Trump in this sense. Both of them won't like to reach 20th of January when the war is still live and kicking in the Middle East. They both would like to see the end of it. Obviously, we have Biden until 20th of January, but that will be the aspiration of both of them. I'm being very brief here. Normalization, again. Everyone. When we saw Trump's administration and Biden's administration, probably Harris will want as well to see how will they promote normalization in the Middle East. Obviously, there are matters here, and I agree with Yoel, we need to re-examine bilateral agreements, but there are certain things that are no-go without Israel. Defense agreement is 65 senators, and it is impossible if Israel is not pro. Q&E, if Israel is not in this game, you can't promote it. And nuclear, obviously, what MBS wants is the ability to enrich on Iranian soil is very problematic. There will be things that they want. They released certain components of weapons for the Saudis recently, but there is tremendous complexity. What was the role in the end, the biggest role of Israel in the normalization agreement? To bring the 16 Republican senators to sign the agreement. That was the biggest role of Netanyahu. Why MBS wants this agreement? For a very simple reason. 2018, because he remembers a new president will come and suddenly they will decide, okay, I'll retire from this agreement. I want it locked. Any other president won't be able to change it. So that's the matter. Nuclear agreement, I agree completely with your analysis. Let's see who are the characters. Zarif in Iran, Sullivan, Blinken, Burrs. We all remember within a decade the involvement of those people in the agreement a decade ago. One of the problems that Iran of 2024 and 2025, I'm not getting to differences, they are different on the level of nuclear, their position on strategic level than Iran of 2014. And still, I think, Harris and Trump will absolutely see that this event is the biggest nightmare if Iran will start, I don't know, move towards the nuclear weapons. That won't require necessarily of the Americans to move 90%, for example. You won't start a war for that, but it's another step towards the nuclear weapons. So both of them will have to decide how will they manage to promote this agreement. I completely echo what Yossi just said and how this whole event will end, because that will impact how each side will be promoting different agreements from their different fields. Thank you, the panel.